think that looks like most people are settled in. Fantastic. Before we begin, I'd like to ask that if any of you have your mobile phones on, if you could turn them off or turn them to silent. That would be great. Before we begin, the NT Writers Festival would like to acknowledge the Aranda people as the traditional owners of the land we are meeting on, Mabantua, Alice Springs. And also welcome to anyone who's joining us live stream from satellite all over the NT. We'd love to receive your questions. Please send them in via text message, beginning with your name and location to 0475 918 400. We'll have a chance for questions both from the audience and from people texting in at the end. But you can text the questions at any time, and that number is 0475 918 400. The topic of the panel today is Cross Currents, the trace of past places, stories and mythologies. And we've got a fantastic panel here today. I'm really excited. First of all, I'd like to introduce Eunice Andrada. Eunice is a poet and teaching artist based in Sydney. Her work is featured in The Guardian and CNN. Her work has been performed in diverse settings, such as in Paris, at the UN climate negotiations, and at the Sydney Opera House. Eunice has been awarded prizes such as the John Marsden Poetry Prize. Her work is centred on displacement and living as a woman of colour, amongst other themes. Eunice incorporates her mother tongue into some of her pieces. She's yet to publish, but she's hoping to do so by the end of the year. And we also have Michelle Cahill. She's an award-winning poet who writes fiction and essays. Her latest books are Letter to Pessoa and The Herring Loss. She won the Vale Valleys Poetry Award, the Hilary Mantel International Short Story Prize, and was shortlisted for the Elizabeth Joly Prize, among others. She was a fellow at Kingston University and a fellow scholar in creative writing at UNC Charlotte. She's written essays on race and cultural diversity for Sydney Review of Books, The Weekend Australia and Cordite. We also have Christopher. Christopher migrated to Melbourne from Kolkata in 1986 with his family and now lives and works in Alice Springs. He's co-author of the play The First Garden and author of the young adult book The Burning Elephant. The First Garden was about Olive Pink, whose botanic garden we're in today. We also have Craig Sandrock, who lives in Central Australia. He has many published works on psychological and intercultural issues. He also composes performance works developed from classic mythic storylines. These often become heart starters in conversations on local issues, mixed relations and cultural preservation. Craig has worked with Joshua Sanspirito on a graphic novel, A Long Weekend in Alice Springs. They're now working on a Sydney Purgatoria, a historical crime set in East Sydney. I think Craig's going to read a little bit from that later today.
I'm going to read from something else.
Oh, sorry, no, from something else, that's all right. So as mentioned, today's session topic is Cross Currents, the trace of past places, stories and mythologies that flow through our bloodlines and storylines, sometimes freely, sometimes like cross currents, pulling us this way and that. So I'd like to ask as we begin if all the authors and poets could speak to that topic and talk a little bit about how different storylines have influenced you and your work, and just briefly on that topic each before we ask some other questions. So maybe I'll start with Michelle.
Okay, hi everyone. It's great to be here, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country. I just feel very welcome here, and it's a great honour to be here. Thank you to the organisers of the festival as well for making it so special. I've spent my life in several countries before I immigrated to Australia, and I had to sort of navigate a range of issues to do with race and class struggle, and I guess being uprooted and and moving to a new place, forgetting that identity, assimilating, learning, connecting with a new country, the landscape, the people, the cultural norms and so forth. It's quite challenging. At the same time, it gives you a kind of in-between flexibility between cultures that can be quite powerful and empowering. It gives you a kind of an ability to dialogue between cultures and a different perspective, a way of seeing, for example, mother country, India, or I spent my significant part of my youth in the UK, so that country, that having a different perspective on that compared to people who are sort of native to that country, I guess, or have always lived there. So, you know, it's being foreign in different places that are actually the place of your heritage, having multiple and mixed heritage, and which I think is not at all uncommon. I think this is something that is really quite part of a universal experience, really. And now we're seeing, like, you know, with the movement of so many people across continents, with you know, the exodus of people, refugees, and also just with transport changing people's mobilities, I think, and the exchange of languages as well and cultures. I think this is not really something so unusual, but there is a kind of a freedom in some ways and an independence, but also a loss, obviously, of a loss of family, of connection, and of larger family, of, you know, national identity. So these are things that I've explored in my work through a range of ways, and I'm also interested in the ways that mixed ancestry people can tell a story that belongs to a national narrative, and what does it mean to have a national narrative, and what are the limitations and restrictions of having those kinds of categories. They're things that are very real to me. So I guess in some ways as writers we work in different ways. On one level we're doing our work, we're just exploring our aesthetic, we're exploring, you know, writing is our tool and our what we do all the time, we're just sort of developing those skills. On the other hand, we're also navigating certain industry dynamics and obstacles, and so that you kind of learn a lot from that. And a lot of what I've kind of developed my writing subsequently, I would say, has been conditioned by those kinds of things that knowledges that I've acquired from that. Oh, okay, this is how these things work. This is what really actually happens, and what kinds of stories are allowed to be told. So that's then sort of moved the direction of my work again, and kind of inspired it, sometimes made it angry and defiant, and made it want to break through, break rules and break across barriers. But I think, you know, in some ways, like, there are definitely barriers, there are definitely borders, and so that's a lot of what my work is about. You know, the more invisible borders around linguistic territory, language territory. I was talking to an artist at lunchtime, and we were talking about the difference between the artistic medium and language, and that we were talking about how perhaps in art and in music, I think that there is less of a focus on meaning as there is in language. Meaning seems to be kind of embedded in how we conceive of language, and that's something that, without consciously sort of, you know, wanting to go against, I can see that that's something that I've been resisting, because in some ways that really is about constructing a beginning, a middle and an end, and leaving things out by creating those borders around this is what this means. I think in somehow language has that tendency to commit to that kind of way of telling stories more than perhaps art, visual arts and music does. And so, yeah, I think that's probably most of that.
That's great. It's fantastic, Michelle. And what about over here, Chris? What in terms of your influences on your work?
Maybe I'll just read a little section.
Go for it.
If there were a beginning, it would have to be Kali. Kali came before the Marxists arrived, before the British took over Calcutta, before the French and Dutch and British competed for India, before the Portuguese discovered the sea route and arrived in the south, before the Muslims and Syrians, and even before the Greeks. Long before Guru Nanak Dev, Muhammad, Saint Judas, Thomas, Jesus and Buddha, Kali was there in Calcutta, laying down her laws for gods and beggars. Govinda often thought of Kali because her fearsome image could be found all over the city, in temples, murals, pavilions, restaurants, classrooms, and even taxis. She had 4 arms, with a sword in one hand and the decapitated head of a demon in another. The other 2 hands blessed her followers. There were 2 heads for earrings, a string of skulls for a necklace, and a belt made from human hands as her skirt. Her tongue protruded from her mouth, her eyes were red, and her face and breast were sullied with blood. She stood with one foot on her thigh and another on the chest of her husband Shiva. I've always been interested in gods and beggars. That interest started off in Calcutta, continued in Alice Springs, where I've lived for 13 years. I'm moving from Alice Springs on Monday. Travelled quite a bit in the last year, and stories are geography, and without stories we couldn't really understand places.
That's great, thanks. Craig, what about you?
That's good, Chris. I like that. Last night some of you may have been here and saw Farida Khwaja perform Electra. And Electra is something that I'm working on now, and I'll explain why later. But we've also participated here in community performances of 5 main Greek dramas. Dionysos, the Bacchae, Persephone, Demeter and Orpheus, and I find that that's where I draw my poetic blood from. You draw it from Kali. Well, you were there before we were, but the Greeks will do me. But it's very similar, the blood, the violence, but also the compassion, it's all there. So later on I'd like to say a bit more about Electra.
Great. Eunice?
I draw my stories from the stories that have been passed down to me from my mother, from my grandmother, as well as the women along the way who have become mother figures to me. It's so important to me to keep holding on to those stories and to uphold those stories because they're stories of survival and of supporting children, because I come from a family of single mothers who have supported their children relentlessly, and they've been real models to me. I also relate a lot to your influences, Christopher. My mother country is the Philippines, which is deeply religious. It's a Catholic nation. And being uprooted from that spirituality in a way, and coming here, I find that the stories I'm writing now navigate that tension between exploring that spirituality that has been jarringly uprooted from the motherland, and how to transplant that here and still utilize it in a way that still shapes my personhood.
Fantastic. So the other question I had was around stories of place, and how those stories of place have inspired your work or influenced your work. So Chris, for example, it'd be interesting to hear about you and your writing of the play, and how the stories of Olive Pink and Alice Springs influenced your work as well. Or feel free to talk about this book as well. But yes, stories of place and how those stories have influenced your work.
So in 2004 I came to Alice Springs. I came to this botanical garden around the same time. And I wondered what the name Olive Pink was about. Initially, I had no idea, and I thought it might refer to some colours. And I also was quite confused with the type of garden it was. I'd never seen a garden like this before, much more botanical garden. So I started to do some research on Olive Pink and the garden. It remains a place where I live close by, and found it quite an interesting experience. It consumed my life for about 5 years. Place is a huge part of storytelling, as I said before, but it helped hone in a particular skill, which was to do something that was site-specific. And I found telling a story that was contained in a particular area quite a powerful tool. A lot of novels jump around in terms of their settings. I didn't like to do that. Hence, my novel, The Burning Elephant, doesn't deal with Australia, but it's completely an Australian novel. And with the play, it just deals with this garden itself, not the whole Alice Springs story. But I find telling stories like that, very local stories, very site-specific stories, give you an insight into the bigger picture. Saying that, now that I've done that twice, I want to do something completely different and expand my horizon. So I recently got a Varuna residency, and I started to work on this story that was set in Australia, but it's not in a site-specific area. And that's a new experience for me. And so I've got to develop some new skills to tell this story. And it's a bit of a challenge. And what I find is writing a story in a place that I'm actually not in quite useful. I found writing a story about India, for example, here, very liberating. So I lived in Alice Springs while I was thinking about India. Now it's time, I think, to write an Australian story, possibly to do with Alice Springs. And I'm leaving. And so I think place is something that you carry with you. We tend to see landscape from a distance. And I'm very interested in that tug of war between being close up to something and also being away from something. So I'm wrestling with those issues right now with the work I'm doing, but I don't have a clear answer. It's just a wrestle.
Do you think when you're living far from the place that you're writing about, that often nostalgia can creep into your writing?
I'm afraid of nostalgia or any of those sentimental ideas. Because I think it needs to have a contemporary edge. I was talking to Tim the Birdman? Lowe before, sorry. And he was talking about, needing to feel some sort of energy, some sort of anger. What was the quote, Nicole? I can't remember, but he said, oh, what did he say? He said, you need to be a bit angry if you're awake, it shows you that you're awake. And so it's not so much nostalgia in that kind of sense. It's just it's just being awake and letting the whole place really hit you. But sometimes to let the whole place hit you, you need to give it some space to really take a good swing at you.
What about Michelle, stories of place?
Maybe this is a moment to say that I also write poetry, and that's quite a different genre to fiction and to the essay. So when you're writing poetry, I find that I do love nature, and place kind of slows down, and connection to the place can become quite powerful within a poem. It can create a very strong connection for the reader, for the writer as well, I guess. So that's quite a different trope. So in my fiction, though, I think my writing has been a little bit concerned more around writing as process, and kind of exploring that. And this particular book, Letter to Pessoa, which is a collection of letters and epistolary pieces, also essayistic fragments and some very experimental figurative pieces as well. I think it was kind of influenced, or it came about partly from, I kept a blog for many years, and in that blog I was creating a space, I was creating a place, I was creating a place where I could address myself and find like that. If I was angry or very upset, it was a place where I could connect with myself by actually writing what I felt was my little truth. At the same time, I knew that I was addressing a public audience. So there was I was learning the skills of how to have a double register and the kinds of nuances of meanings that could create, the multiplicities of that. So I think in a way that, that whole idea of process and sketching and drafting and writing as a place of connecting with reading as well, connecting with reading writers whose work I admire and responding to that. But also, place in my fiction is, there is physical place because some of the stories go into Nepal and sort of a bit. Sometimes you will recognise, I think, the obvious touristic signposts, but at other times, perhaps a little bit more off the beaten track. So Nepal, Spain, Portugal, some stories set in America and the UK and Kenya, where I was born. So there's quite a lot of physical places, not all of which I visited either and travelled through, but very much also internal space. So what about the place inside? I'm very interested, I think, in the psychological places and spaces that we inhabit. And perhaps that's probably because as a migrant, that becomes so very important because you are moving so much, and it is such a contingent life. It is really a life where you have to leave so much, and it's more about the movement than what actually you carry inside might be the only thing you have. What about if you can't actually set down roots and you are a dispersal? The stories, I was interested in finding out, what if I've got no narrative? What do I do if all I have is language? And there's one particular story in this called The Flower Thief, which is very much like that. It was just an idea. It was just really a seed. And I thought, I want to see how far I can take this. And it took me a really long time to write, and it's probably very indulgent. But I did convince the editor to include it. So that was it was like, I think he probably just wanted to make me feel good that yes, it worked. It works, it's good. So, but I'm not sure. It is risky. So there's a lot of risk-taking writing in it as well. So yeah, I think that's probably all the things I want to say.
That's fabulous. Eunice, what about the stories from particular places that have influenced your poetry or?
So for me, writing about place is deeply rooted in memory, but also recreated memory. And that recreated memory comes from passed down stories that where I've had to fill in the gaps myself, where my mother or my grandmother's memory falters. That's where the huge torrent of emotion comes in, which is why when I come to a certain place or when I come back to the Philippines, it's so hard to write about where you are, because there's this huge torrent of emotion, this grief of loss and disconnection, this need to sort of prove to other people that you are from there. And often my writing explores that disconnection, but also that authenticity that you have to prove you're from a place to other people. So, but also writing in regards to place and making space, writing has been a way of reclaiming that space. If I don't belong there or I don't belong here, then writing has been a way of reclaiming that voice and space for myself. Like you said, Michelle, how blogging and fiction has been your way of speaking your own truth and creating that for yourself. I've found that my poetry has been a platform for that.
Fantastic. Craig?
Yes, thanks. I'm going to have to stand up for this. I'm going to read or recite about 10 lines from Electra from last night.
Right.
And I'd be very keen to hear what it does in terms of place with a few people here. That's probably my heart starter in there. Okay, this is from Aeschylus Oresteia, but I've rewritten it. And the situation is this: in the original play 2,005 years ago, the Eumenides, the Furies, or the Erinyes, as they're referred to, are the custodians of women's law, mother's law in Greece at the time. They had a cave within what is now called Athens, a cave at the foot of where the Acropolis now is. This was their site, but they were expelled from it. They returned to Athens for the trial of Arrestees. And this is what Electra says. Now, I'd just like you to listen, and those of you who live in this place see if there's any connection whatsoever to the place here. And I, Electra, said to the women custodians of their own and their old law, "How many of you sit in your cave beneath the hill?" And they said, 12. And I said, "I acknowledge you. Your sorrow, old ladies, for the loss of the order you set in place so long ago. Jealousy, ladies, for the blue-eyed gods who came and took away so much, ruined your cave beneath the hill, cut up the rocks. Hunger, old ladies, for you scratch through rubbish for your food. Loss, grandmothers, for all the gifts you brought mankind. Grief, grandmothers, for all the young girls. Confusion, ladies, worst of all, this confusion. So select 12 people from the streets. Let them hear the account of this crime. Let them judge this man. Let those who live at the site of this crime decide." My question is that Athens or is it here? My question is that Athens 2,500 years ago, or is that Alice Springs 2017?
Yeah, that interconnectedness of story.
Yeah, so while you're writing, sometimes you can be quite focused on a place or telling a story that's site-specific or you know, and it's so focused. But what I found after writing was readers' reactions and their interpretation of that place. And that becomes quite an interesting shift because, for example, at the end of last year I was in Guangzhou and my book was launched in China with Nicholas Jose, and while he was launching the book, he gave a description of my book, but everyone in the room felt it was like he was talking about Tiananmen Square. And of course, and he couldn't mention Tiananmen Square, but by talking about the riots in India in 1984, it paralleled what was happening in China. Similarly, in the Jakarta Post, Dina, Indonesian journalist, wrote a review of The Burning Elephant. And she said, "Oh, I couldn't help but think this book was so relevant to Indonesia." So now I've gone away, like, I'm actually more interested in how the readers are interpreting the place as opposed to my interest in that site-specific place.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a really strange experience as I hear from others about how they then interpret the place that I was so busy focused on, and how then it transcended that local site-specific nature of a place to a broader sense, the vastness of the world, I guess.
It's good, Chris.
So, I mean, in response to what you were saying, is it Alice Springs or Greece? It depends who your reader
Your
is, I
audience.
guess.
Yeah. And in relation to place, I had another question. This was specifically for Eunice, but feel free for the rest of you to also answer this if it relates to your work. But Eunice incorporates in lots of her poetry her mother tongue, which is Tagalog. And I'd be interested to hear about the process of choosing which words to include in your poetry. And are you choosing those words because of the flow, or because of there's no adequate translation, or it just feels right? So I'd be interested to hear about that process.
So the process of translation in my work comes from a lot of imagery. There are a lot of rich images and symbols in the Filipino language that are just too beautiful to translate. They sound so beautiful in Tagalog as well. So I wouldn't see the point of trying to assimilate that beauty into the English language. I think it's disrespectful even to try to take that and morph it into a new body. It's really important to me, coming from, a bilingual household, and growing up with a mother who's had to almost literally morph her language into new bodies for her children to understand her. So I've always wanted to uphold those stories and those images wherever I can in my poetry.
Great. Has anyone else had any experiences of that in your writing?
What was the question?
So it was around mother tongue and translation and choosing words.
Well, yes,
Yep.
so used a number of Indian words in this novel, and there was some consideration to put a glossary, but then decided against that and tried to make those words, the Hindi words, just fit in such a way that the reader could understand. And also there was a political aspect, I guess, to it, like as in who's your reader? Is your reader, I mean, sure, it's an Australian publisher, but is your reader, a non-Indian or an Indian? It didn't matter. So, someone asked me, are you writing for white people? But I didn't want to go there. But so you could put a glossary. I mean, in the Olive Pink play, we use some Warlpiri words in the text. And we did, for Currency Press, when it got published by Currency Press, we used translations. We approached 3 or 4 of our Warlpiri friends to help with those, with the translations, and each one of them had a different spelling and for the word. So it's challenging, I mean, in terms of mother tongue and
Yeah, I'd agree with Chris there. I'm also South Asian. I'm also of Indian heritage, like Chris. And in my second collection of poems, the book is called Vishvarupa, which means many forms, and it's the form that Krishna shows to Arjuna and the Bhagavad Gita when he's got many, many heads. And I thought that it was a wonderful kind of metaphor for the multiplicity that in a way, like challenging a national identity or national literature or whatever. There's that sort of like. Actually, the Hindu gods is interesting because ultimately, although there is this multiplicity and so many of them, there is actually one Brahma. So it's still kind of like a religion of one God, actually. So that's kind of like, in some ways, that's what nationalities do as well. Nations do that. Like, they have this multiplicity and they have like diversity, but essentially there's one identity in a way. So that was interesting. It gave me that provocation. But just to get back to Vishvarupa, the word and the language and the translation, in that book of poems, which was themed on Hindu gods. I'm really glad that I chose that title. There was another title that I was thinking of, which was Invisible World, and a friend of mine was in brackets, Invisible World, and a friend of mine said, "Oh no, that's so postmodern. That's just like theory shit, you know. Like, don't do that, you know." And Vishwarupa, that's great. I'm really glad that I went with that, because there are actually so very few titles that are actually in English, and that just says something about how dominating English is as a language. And also the diacritics, that also was like another challenge that in the text, and that's another thing that I had to think about. But I guess in a way, what Eunice and Chris just taken from there is like, there's a sense for me in the experience that I've had with those diacritics, and I'm just monolingual, you know, so I mean, I actually questioned my authenticity to do that very much, but I guess what I was doing is I was bringing my own take on it, and my own, I was being experimental and doing something different, and leaving a mark, I guess, in a different way, and but the idea that it's always just a draft in a way, the typography is always kind of, there's no final thing, you know, there's always something that can be different in a text. And Eunice was talking about how language is actually a body, and I think that's a beautiful concept to, yeah.
Well, the language, I just tell you this, really. The first time I tried to write a version of the Dionysos, the Greek. I don't really know Greek, I've learned a bit, but I was more interested in the structure of the Greek language and the fact that so much of the early Greek language was simply descriptions of action without poetic or abstract terminology. And as I listened to Pitangara and Walpurgi, I can't figure out Andrada at all. But the so-called song lines are all, in my reading of the translations, actions. There's not one abstract, philosophical, or even poetic image. So I tried to write the Dionysus story, and then the Persephone story, and then the Persephone 2, and now Electra, in a really simple action form. She did this, she did that, she went there, she saw this, they did that, and not a single symbolic phenomena in the language. And I think that's a lesson that those of us who live here can learn, because so much of the English academic, bureaucratic, policy making is in a language that no one can comprehend.
It's true. And I was also going to ask, particularly Michelle. Michelle has some brilliant essays, and if you haven't had a chance to read them, I really recommend them. I've actually read some of them twice. They're brilliant. But in one of her essays, Who is Lobbying for Migrant Writers?, Michelle mentions the concept of interceptionality. Michelle writes, and this is from her essay, but interceptionality is equally about mapping, marking the space of our absence as much as the space of our resistance. Can you speak about your role as an interceptor as well as a writer and what that means?
At the most direct level, I guess, as an interceptor, I've been working as an editor for a literary journal, Mascara, which started out because I guess as a writer, when I started out, there were so many obstacles to getting published. This is going back like 15 years or so. It was just so hard, and I was thinking, well, you know, I can get my own ideas about what what I think is good writing, and I was having conversations with Bowie Kim Cheng. He was another migrant writer from Singapore, and he had some great ideas, and so we formed this journal, Mascara, and our aim was to... I wasn't so much thinking of myself as Asian, actually. I didn't even think of that, but he was talking about an Asian Australian journal, and that got me thinking about... it actually was the development, it helped me to develop my work, my relationship with him and the conversations with him, which were quite formative to part of my work. And of course now I've moved on into different directions again, as one does. But yeah, so in a direct way, that's been my interception, like challenging. And starting out, we have worked on just... a very minimal resources, very stretched resources, and been able to, I think, achieve sort of small and significant impacts and bring about some changes, one of which was an anthology, Contemporary Asian Australian Poets, which was sort of one of the first anthologies like that here, presenting about 30 odd, from memory, about 30 Asian Australian poets, half of whom were women, which I was really happy about. So that on that level, it was like, well, like, why do we have to accept these hegemonies, really, and these hierarchies? But I guess, like, I've learned a lot through that whole thing of being an editor, so much, like how the conversations that I have had with people, including organisations, individual persons, institutions, has taught me a lot about colonialism and how it operates. And basically how it operates is quite simple. It operates on hierarchy. It operates on the idea that the white is the one, that is what the one is, and everything else is a copy of it and has to copy it. And it operates on a basic level of superiority. And that actually is a psychological thing. It goes into your head, and you actually, and I've seen it, I see it being played out every single day. I see it in the way that people of colour back down from situations and white people take over. And I think white privilege, and people don't like to talk about it, but in a way it is something, not to make people feel bad, but it is something that's deeply inscribed historically, so to the point that it's kind of taken for granted, I guess. So one of the things I've learned through my work in Mascara was, if I think I'm as equal, if I don't think I'm inferior, then I'm no longer inferior, and that's how I can intercept. I can write an email to people and I can say, your festival has got no people of colour in it. Why? And of course it's like, oh, who's she? Anyway, so intersectionality was something that was on my mind, but it takes obviously from the word intersectionality. I wanted to think about Kimberl Crenshaw. She sort of first theorised this, I think, 10, 15, maybe more years ago. I'm not exactly sure at the exact time that she did, but it was around cases of domestic violence in the US, where what she was describing was that her initial essay was that women who were, that gender, race, class complicated the outcomes for women or for people in these situations of domestic violence as far as the justice system went. So that was her expertise, was in that, in criminal justice. But there's been so much about it, and it's been taken up, this word intersectionality, and it's like it's always being thrown around. But what actually public policy and arts policy hasn't really changed. There are so many obstacles to it. So I think that's why I started to theorise intersectionality, and I've been very fortunate that because I haven't had a formal book around it, that I've had some really fantastic supporters like Catriona Menzies-Pike, the editor of the Sydney Review of Books, who supported my essay. So I was able to sort of write about it. And there's another essay coming out which further theorises it next week. and looking at reviews in critical writing and discourse as a way of creating and structuring meaning, not just actually reflecting on it, but actually creating and pinning it down, such that, for example, people of colour, often their books get misinterpreted so heavily by critical writers and discourse to the point that it cannot be retrieved back to what they were actually intending to do. Why does this happen? How powerful is discourse, and how can we intercept it? I think these are sort of questions that go to the root of like institutions and power and the law, really, legal structures, structural racism and stuff like that. And I just think that language is very powerful, but it is also something where we can bring about liberty. We can use it, and that's all that I've been able to do, is to use language in a challenging way, and to always keep in mind I'm an equal. And intersectionality works by breaking the frame, by showing who we are. We're not just someone on the periphery of a story. We're actually at the centre of the story, where we're angry, or at the centre of the story because we're laughing and we're saying, hey, isn't this funny? Like, I'm allowed to laugh at the fact that this is how I'm being treated. I'm always being shortlisted a dozen times. Yeah, right. Okay, I'm allowed to be sceptical about these things. Are you telling me that there aren't hierarchies? Is that, actually we're not even allowed to have a response. So intersectionality is about showing ourselves as a true subject that isn't just a flat subject that has, a smiling face and an angry face, but many faces, and just a true to own our subjectivity, and not for it to be authored by others upon us, which is what discourse does. It authors us. And how do we reclaim that? And that's what intersectionality is about. It's about breaking the frame. And even though it's like a transient thing, in that exchange of dialogue, it's just a transient exchange of equality. It's kind of cumulative. It accumulates, and little by little we take little steps forward.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. Now we are coming into a time of questions. So are there questions from the audience that people would like to ask, either all the authors and poets or individual people? I can hand the mic around.
Come on.
I was very interested in Chris's point, and I think Michelle and others have also made the point about the apparent re-emergence of a story, of a narrative, in different contexts. And you write about India, and then someone says, well, Tiananmen Square or Jakarta or wherever. But I think it's also a reference, is it not, to the fact there are underlying discourses that are pan in their nature, that are reflected in different narratives, but that what we recognise as a discourse. Do you think that would be the case?
I don't really know about discourse and all those sort of things. I just know that all stories are like rivers. They're all sort of, and tributaries. And I love rivers and tributaries and stories, and I love how they just can all just come from a mountain and then go all through the country and then flow into an ocean and just tumble along and drop things here that create good soil for other trees to grow and good produce. And really, I love stories, and the only reason why I write is because I love other people's stories. And it's an ongoing conversation with books, and I feel really privileged to be able to do that. In terms of who we read who we like, we read who tells us good stories. And if you want to support writers of diversity or Aboriginal writers or female writers, just go buy their books. And, we don't need any discourse and any more explanations. You know, if you haven't bought my book, you can buy it, and then and that's how my publisher will probably, you know, publish another Indian Australian writer. I mean, that's what happened in England. That's what happened in America. I mean, you know, in America and England, the Indians are too busy writing stories to be arguing who should be reading stories. You know, Salman Rushdie wouldn't come up here and say, hey, you know, why should we be writing stories? They're just buying his books by the ships full, you know? I mean, do we still have ships? Well, you know, so just go and buy a book. It's only $20 and, you know, it's like a jug of beer, you know? So that's the best way I think you can support stories and keep them going. And for publishers like, you know, University of Western Australia or Giramondo or these small publishers that take risks, you know, with because it costs a lot of money, and so just buy the books and keep the publishers happy, because they'll keep publishing us if you buy our books. It's as simple as that, I think.
Thanks.
And our job is to tell really good stories, and you know, and work at it. And we, like, it's the Beatles song, you know, it took us years to write.
Yeah, lifetimes. Is there any other questions from the audience?
Put your hand up really high.
Did we receive any text questions? No. Yep. What are my spare questions? Do we have time?
Yeah, you could ask one more question.
Yep. I guess there was also a notion in today about the stories that have stopped us in our tracks, the stories that have influenced us and put us on a whole new trajectory from what we were on before. And I'd be interested to hear from all the authors of a story or an event, that's something that has changed that trajectory for you and the course. I kept thinking of Sally Morgan, and when she found out about her Aboriginality and how that changed her whole life trajectory from that point, but it could be something else entirely. So maybe start with Eunice, of a story or an event or something that happened.
A story that is completely, well, it's a series, it's a mess. The mess that has changed the trajectory of my writing has been the recent, political situation in the Philippines, with the coming of someone who I view as a dictator, Rodrigo Duterte, and his war on drugs, which is really a war on poor people. And that has really changed how I view, Filipinos as, as a Filipino here, as people I've left behind, but also there's this sense of betrayal there that's sort of manifested in my writing and in my poetry about how I view the Philippines and how could they let this happen. So that's a huge story that's influenced my writing a lot.
Great, thank you. What about over here, Craig?
Well, the book that most recently has changed my trajectory, and which lies behind why we wanted to show you a lecture, is Kieran Finnane's Trouble. Kieran Finnane's reporting of the courts, putting down details that none of us could quite grasp until it was all in one place, is, I think, similar to the Filipino experience. And when I read Kieran's book a year ago, it took me months to work out, as it were, what next, even though a lot of my work is involved in exactly the same places and people in her book, Trouble, on crime and on trial in Central Australia. So that led me directly to go back to Aeschylus and the trial that changed the judicial system in democratic Greece. Would that we could do that here. So thank you, Kieran.
Chris?
I've always been interested in the idea of the sojourner, and as a sojourner, you just keep passing through, and along the way you get to see lots of different things, and hopefully you've got your notebook close at hand and you can write them down. And so that's my trajectory. I just continue being a sojourner, and hopefully I've got a working pen and paper.
Great. Michelle?
Well, I've been reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and I really like the way that it's really sharp about imperial themes, and but also obviously the writing is that the way that it changes. It's so fluid in the way that it changes perspectives, experimentation. Yeah, I like all her work.
Thank you. That's fantastic. You all want to give a round of applause for our authors and poets. And I think some of their books and work are available here to purchase.
For $20?
Yeah, Chris has mentioned. I also want to let you know that both Eunice and Michelle will be reading at the reading rooms tonight. There's still tickets available. It's going to be a progressive performance of intimate readings at the Residency at 7:30 tonight, and that sounds like a real treat. So please join us again tomorrow in the Gardens for the final day of the Northern Territory Writers' Festival. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.